Okay, criminology, so getting right to it, this is chapter 4. This is the second chapter that you have to read for this week. This chapter, we're on the early schools of criminology, as well as the previous lecture, which was on chapter 3, victimology. But getting right to it, I'm not gonna waste any time. I'm gonna go over the learning objectives, the things that you're supposed to get out of this lecture this week, because there's only a couple of them. So our authors want us to be able to summarize the pre-classical notions of crime and criminals. They want us to explain the assumptions about human nature held by the classical school and the elements of punishment outlined by Beccaria. They want us to be able to compare the differences between the classical and the positivist schools. They also want us to be able to compare specific and general deterrence in the context of perpetual deterrence theory. They want us to expound on the legacies of the classical and positivist schools. And lastly, they want us to evaluate the policy implications of deterrence theories. And we'll get into that at the end. So let's start off with our pre-classical notions of crime and criminals. Prior to the 18th century, explanations of a wide variety of phenomenon, including criminal behavior, tended to be of religious or spiritual nature. In chapter 2, measuring crime and criminal behavior, our authors, Walsh and Jorgensen, did go into this. However, they classified this in terms of eras, if you remember. And they really put this into the supernatural era. So people at this time, again, prior to the 18th century, would explain crime and even victimization through the lens of spirits, demonic possession, bad luck, etc. Okay? So a simple extension of this worldview was to define crime as a result of demonic possession or evil abuse of free will. And our book goes into specifically the legacy of original sin, okay? Enlightenment thinkers at the time believed in dignity and the worth of the individual, a view that would eventually find expression in the law and in the treatment of criminal offenders. Now moving into modern criminology, right? Looking at crime, so into the 18th century, we're going into the 18th century, surpassing the 18th century, and we're now looking at crime from two different schools of thoughts, right? So we're looking at it now in modern criminology through the classical lens and as well as through the positivist. And we're going to start off with the classical school, the classical lens, and how they calculate criminal behavior, crime, etc. The classical position maintains that punishment should fit the crime and nothing else. That is, all people convicted of similar crimes should receive the same punishment regardless of any differences that they may have. So regardless of differences in race, class, gender, age, sexual orientation, disability, the crime should always fit the punishment. So, you know, yeah, it's self-explanatory, okay? Beccaria is known as the father of classical criminology. Beccaria published a call for the reform of the judicial and the penal system through Europe, called On Crime and Punishment, okay? For any of you who are criminology majors, for any of you who are CJ majors, I know if you are a sociology major, you are going to have to read this in undergrad. But I do suggest you read it because his classical school and his way of thought is very influential in specifically how we can use his thought today to reformulate or reform the criminal justice system, okay? So he argued that criminal statuses and the penalties they prescribe should be codified and published so that the public could be made aware of differential treatment based on the whims of judges. So in his book on crime and punishment, we clearly see how Beccaria thinks about the criminal, what he thinks about the what he thinks about specifically criminal justice or criminology at his time. And he lays out his beliefs and his arguments right from the start. I'm going to go over his beliefs right now that we have listed up. Again, some of this I might have already stated some of this in this lecture already. So some of his beliefs, Beccaria states that citizens give up certain rights for protection from the state. And because we give up certain types of rights for protection, right, for our homes to be protected, for our bodies and our properties to be protected, we should therefore have these laws and policies codified and published so that we can see whether or not punishment is fairly given out or is it unequally given out. And judges should not be able to just interpret the law and give out judgment and give out punishment based on whims, okay? So a judge in the courtroom can't have two individuals who have committed the same crime, right, punished differently. So I can't be a judge and be like, yo, that guy's disabled, 13 years. Yo, that guy's able-bodied, 2 hours of community service. That should not happen, okay? Some other beliefs of Beccaria is that he was against the use of torture, he was against capital punishment, and he also stated that criminal statuses should be codified, as I said, and published for citizens, for us, okay? Beccaria, and again, I might repeat myself in a few areas. Beccaria argued that individuals had free will and were influenced by the plain and pleasure principle, where people weighed the benefits of crime to cost of punishment. He elaborated on these three elements, again, in crime and on punishment. Before I go into the three elements, those elements again are certainty, swift, and severity. I do want to state that Beccaria argued that the tendency of man, so I'm saying of man, which can mean men, women, and whoever else you identify. So argue that the tendency of man to give in to the despotic spirit had to be countered by the threat of punishment. So the tendency of a person to give into criminal behavior, to give into doing a crime had to be countered. We have to deter that, right, with the threat of punishment. So for that person or for us not to give in to doing something criminal, there has to be some kind of punishment or threat of punishment, okay? And this had to be certain, swift, and severe enough if offenders are to be deterred from future crime. So let's go into those three elements, okay, of punishment. Certainty, and these are direct quotes taken from In Crime and Punishment, On Crime and Punishment, okay? Certainty. The certainty of punishment, even if it be moderate, will always make a stronger impression than the fear of another, which is more terrible, but combined with the hope of impunity, okay? So when it comes to certainty, I'm gonna try to give you guys examples for this. If we know it's better to have crimes that are attached to punishments that are always guaranteed, okay? So for instance, in certain countries, if I steal something, it is guaranteed that my hand is going to be cut off or my finger is going to be cut off or something, right? If that is guaranteed, that is going to serve as a deterrent, not only to the person who just had their hand cut off, they're not going to want their other hand cut off, so they're not going to do that again. But if citizens know that, we're not going to do that. However, if there are crimes out there where the punishment you know, is said to be, it can be terrible, right? But there is hope that I can get off. It's not going to serve as a deterrence. Okay. And we can think, we're in the United States, we can think of some of those, right? Where I'm going to use myself as an example, right? Where there are crimes that I have seen people who are not like myself get off with. But I know, because it serves as a deterrence for me. I know that if I do it, oh, it's over. So for me, it's certain that it's over, right? So that's definitely going along with Beccaria's, you know, element of, you know, one of the elements of, one of the elements of punishment, sorry. Okay, so definitely it's a deterrence for me. But for others, it may not serve as a deterrence. I can do this, you know, like, what's the likelihood of me getting off on this? It's probably a lot. Let's do it, okay? Certainty. The next element of punishment that he says that must be present is that it has to be, the punishment has to be swift. So he says that the more promptly and the more closely punishment follows upon the commission of a crime, the more just and useful it will be. So using that example again of my hand getting cut off, right? I know it's certain if I'm in certain countries that if I steal and my hand's cut off, yo, the next day, like not my hand's cut off. So if I know I steal, right? And the punishment, right, is going to be that my hand's cut off, that punishment has to happen swift. It has to happen like the next day. Not literally the next day, but it has to happen soon. Okay? So the punishment has to be swift right after. So again, in our criminal justice system, Beccaria is saying that, you know, it has to be certain with this, these are the crimes, these are the punishments. This is when they're given out. Okay? That can also serve as a deterrence. Okay? And the last one is severity. He says that for punishment to attain its end, the evil which it inflicts has only to exceed the advantage derivable from the crime. In this excess of evil, one should include the loss of the good which the crime might have produced, and all beyond this is superficial and for that reason tyrannical. Okay? In other words, okay, very jargony, in other words, the crime has to fit the punishment. Okay? So for instance, I have just stolen, you know, something here. I'm going to use the stealing example again. I've stolen a MacBook from Apple and I got caught. Okay? We know that the punishment is certain. This is the United States of America, right? I don't necessarily know that the punishment will be swift, but to serve as a deterrence, it needs to be severe, right? So the punishment for stealing this MacBook and then selling it somewhere and them not being able to find it has to be severe. So what's equivalent? What's a punishment equivalent to the loss of a MacBook for about, let's just say, with all the hookups, $2,000? What is that? Is it a year in prison? Is it 2 years in prison? 3? Maybe it's just like some form of community service to make up the hours it took to build that, etc. Okay? So the loss of the good needs to fit the crime. Okay? It needs to be as severe, not necessarily over severe, as severe. Okay? There are some crimes that I do think you can't even, I don't know how you could do it. Murder being one of them, the loss of a loved one. Okay? Let's get into another person who is influential in the classical school. This is Jeremy Bentham and his thoughts on human nature. Okay? Jeremy Bentham, he wrote The Principles of Morals and Legislation. The Principles of Moral and Legislation is essentially a philosophy of social control based on the principles of utility, which prescribe the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Again, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The principle of utility posits or states that any human action should be judged moral or immoral by the effects that it has on the happiness of the community. Thus, the proper function of the legislature is to pass laws aimed at maximizing the pleasure and minimizing the pain of the largest number of society. Again, the greatest good for the greatest number. If legislatures are to legislate according to the principle of utility, they must understand human motivation and behavior. Free will enables human beings to purposely and deliberately choose to follow a calculated course of action. On the other hand, hedonism is the greatest single motivator of human action. Jeremy Bentham also goes into rational behavior, hedonistic calculus, and also the panopticon, okay? In regards to rational behavior is behavior that is consistent with logic, okay? People are said to behave rationally when we observe a logical fit between the goals they strive for and the means they use to achieve them. The hedonistic calculus summarizes the classical notion of human nature as hedonistic, rational, and possessed of free will. And then panopticon is a prison designed by Jeremy Bentham. So this is at the end of his Principle of Morals of Legislation. A panopticon is a prison designed by Bentham, which was to be a circular inspection house, enabling guards to constantly see their charges. Okay. Let's go into, and sorry if you hear my sister screaming, she is on the first floor, I'm on the second, but sorry for that, okay? Let's go into the rise of positivism, okay? This is the second school of thought. When it comes to positivism, and before we get into all of this, I do want to state that there are terms that are thrown throughout this section. So just be aware of that, okay? And one of those are determinism. Determinism simply means that events have causes that precede them, okay? Similar to chemists and physicists using the scientific method to investigate our physical world, the positivist criminologists sought to employ the scientific method to investigate our behavioral world. Positivism in the social sciences is used to designate the extension of the scientific method from which more positive knowledge can be obtained to social life, okay? The positivist position is that punishment should fit the offender and be appropriate to rehabilitation. Again, the positivist position is that punishment should fit the offender and be appropriate to rehabilitation. Enrico Ferri and his best short description of the differences between the classical and positive criminology distinguish between this, okay? So I may leave it there, the rise of positivism, okay? Know the distinction between positivism and classical, because it is a slight difference. So again, the positive position is that punishment should fit the offender and be appropriate to rehabilitation, whereas the classical position is that punishment should fit the crime and nothing else, so that all people convicted of similar crimes should receive the same punishment regardless of any differences that they may have. Okay, so just remember that.